Your expert is Craig L. Symonds, a professor emeritus of history at the U.S. Naval Academy and a former Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College. He wrote the award-winning book, Decision at Sea: 5 Naval Battles That Shaped American History.
The night was dark. So dark, in fact, that the water in the St. Lawrence River looked like ink. Small boats crammed to the gills with red-coated British soldiers made agonizingly slow progress toward a line of cliffs looming 170 feet above the northern bank. The British general who had ordered this movement was 32-year-old James Wolfe, and he knew he was taking an enormous risk. His objective was the French citadel of Quebec, high on a bluff overlooking the St. Lawrence River and protected by thick stone walls. Twice previously, Wolfe had tried to approach it overland. Each time his troops had been thrown back. Since then, many of his soldiers had fallen ill, and as the fall weather began to slip away, Wolfe feared that if he did not strike now, in September, winter would set in, and his opportunity would be lost. So, in a desperate gamble, he ordered his soldiers to embark in small boats, cross the river, and land at a cove at the base of that line of bluffs, only a mile from the city. From there, a path led up to the plateau above, but the ascent was steep and narrow, so narrow in places that the soldiers had to proceed in single file, subject to discovery at any moment. It was a terrible risk. And aware of that, Wolfe penned a letter of apology in advance to his superiors in London in case the move proved disastrous. "If I am mistaken," he wrote, "I am sorry for it and must be answerable to His Majesty and the public for the consequences." It's easy to imagine the confusion as the soldiers struggled upward in the dark over an unfamiliar trail, stopping and starting, the silence no doubt broken by occasional muffled curses. The first of them to reach the crest filed out onto a large open pasture that bore the name of a local farmer, Abraham Martin, and was therefore known as the Plains of Abraham. As the number of British soldiers grew, their officers sorted them into groups and then into lines, and by the time the eastern sky lightened with the coming of dawn, a substantial body of red-coated soldiery had spread out in a long line on the open plain outside the walls of the French citadel. Inside those walls, the man commanding the French garrison, the 47-year-old Marquis de Montcalm, might have decided to stay there and force Wolfe's soldiers to fight their way in. Instead, he chose to sortie from the fort with his army and meet the British in the open. It was a fatal error. Montcalm and the French had the numbers, but British discipline won the day. The line of redcoats held their fire against the advancing French until they were within 30 yards. Then they fired a double-shotted volley that broke their line and sent the survivors fleeing. Both of the opposing generals fell mortally wounded. Wolfe was killed in the first exchange. Montcalm died during the French retreat. The full impact of that brief exchange would not be evident for months. But in fact, the British victory on the Plains of Abraham on September 13, 1759, was one of the battles on which history pivoted. The defeat of Montcalm and the French at Quebec effectively stripped Canada from the French Empire and added it to the British Empire. My name is Craig Symonds, Professor Emeritus at the U.S. Naval Academy, and the former Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College. I was the author and host of a previous Wendrium series on the Pacific Theater in World War II, and I will be your host for this series of talks about the history of the United States Navy that will take us from the age of sailing ships to the era of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, from Quebec in 1759 to the Taiwan Straits in the 21st century, from wooden ships and smoothbore cannon to missiles and satellites. You may wonder, if this is a lecture series about the United States Navy, why do I begin with a land battle outside Quebec 17 years before the United States even declared its independence? Two reasons. First, an argument can be made that the events on the Plains of Abraham that day lit the fuse of the American Revolution and led to the nation's founding. Montcalm's defeat removed the threat of a French invasion of the American colonies from Canada, and at the same time, it compelled the British to pay for the war by levying new taxes on their American subjects. The famous 19th century historian Francis Parkman claimed that with the fall of Quebec began the history of the United States. A second reason why we're interested in Quebec is that it illustrates the key factor that made Wolfe's victory possible in the first place: British command of the sea. The British Royal Navy had near absolute command of the seas in the 18th century. It brought Wolfe's army to Canada and sustained it there, and if the attack had failed, it offered the means of extracting his army. The naval dominance had emerged slowly over several centuries as Britain won naval wars against first the Spanish, then the Dutch, and now the French, in a series of wars that dated back to the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. So before discussing the birth of the United States and the United States Navy, let's take a look at the character of naval warfare in the Age of Sail. The backbone of Western navies in this era was something called a ship of the line. The name derives from the fact that navies in the Age of Sail generally maneuvered and fought in a line-ahead formation, following one another like ducks on a string. That made sense because the guns were lined up along the sides of each ship. When all those guns fired together, it was called a broadside. It's pretty self-evident that sailing in any formation other than a line ahead risked what is today called friendly fire. A ship of the line was about 200 feet long, and it generally had two rows or decks of cannon, marked off by white stripes, so their armament was evident to all. And for that reason, they were also sometimes called two-deckers. In the early 18th century, the number of guns on a ship of the line varied from 50 to over 100, but by the time of the American Revolution, the number had been more or less standardized at 74, roughly 35 guns on each side, plus a few bow and stern chasers. Thus, a ship of the line, or a two-decker, was also sometimes called a 74. A few ships of the line were even larger. The Royal Navy had some that carried as many as 100 guns. On those ships, the guns were arrayed in 3 decks instead of 2. The most famous 3-decker is HMS Victory, which carried 100 guns and was Horatio Nelson's flagship in the famous Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. It floats still in Portsmouth Historic Navy Yard. Ships of the line were majestic vessels. As a naval historian, I think they were quite beautiful, especially when under full sail. On the other hand, that beauty disguised a coarse and unpleasant environment. For one thing, they were quite crowded. Each of them carried a crew of 600 to 800 men, and the triple-deckers, like the Victory, might have a crew of 1,000. Scores of men were needed to loosen or furl the sails, which had to be done by hand as crewmen wrestled with the heavy sails and a complex web of rigging. More men were needed to man the guns, each of which weighed 5,000 pounds or more, and were manhandled across the deck by brute force. All that meant that European navies, and especially the Royal Navy, were constantly in need of manpower. Engagements between these elegant engines of war were cauldrons of unimaginable violence. When a lookout spied an enemy on the horizon and shouted the news down to the officer of the deck, the captain would order the ship to clear for action. That involved reducing sail, sometimes slinging chains under the spars to keep damaged rigging from crashing down onto the crew. Bulkheads, the interior walls of the ship, were knocked down to give the gun crews room to work. The galley fires were extinguished. The crews cast loose the heavy guns from their restraints. Powder boys as young as 10 years old brought up ammunition from the magazine. Amazingly, a well-trained crew could do all that in 5 to 10 minutes as the ships slowly closed on one another. If it was a fleet engagement, the two opposing ships maneuvered to within effective gun range, which was only about 60 to 100 yards. Such a close range was necessary because the smoothbore cannon used to fire the cannonballs were wildly inaccurate over longer distances. They were so close, in fact, that you could see the expressions on the faces of your enemy and even shout insults at them during the fight. Once engaged, the two fleets simply hammered away at each other as fast as they could load and fire, with the white smoke generated by the black powder obscuring visibility. At that point, the captains and admirals often had little to do but calmly walk the quarterdeck to offer an example of coolness under fire. The guns on all the ships were muzzle loaders. For each shot, the gun had to be sponged out so the embers from the previous shot didn't ignite the powder prematurely. Then pre-measured bags of powder were shoved into the muzzle and rammed home by a ramrod. The shot was placed in the muzzle and it was rammed home as well. Often wadding was added to keep the cannonball from simply rolling out again. The projectiles were solid, round shot, literally iron balls. On rare occasions, the shot could be heated in a ship's galley in the hope of starting a fire on the enemy ship. But that was a risky undertaking, since a dropped hot cannonball could ignite a fire on your own ship. In addition to round shot and hot shot, there was also something called bar shot, which was two cannonballs connected by a rod. Its function was to take down spars or rip up sails on the enemy ship so it could not maneuver. And there was chain shot, which, as the name suggests, was two cannonballs connected by a chain, which could be used against rigging or as an anti-personnel weapon. And finally, there was grape or grape shot. This was a canister filled with dozens of golf ball-sized round shot. Firing a load of grape shot into a crowded deck was devastating, like a giant's shotgun. And there were the splinters. A 24 or 32-pound cannonball smashing into the bulwarks of a wooden ship created giant splinters as big as a man's leg that flew across the deck to cause devastating wounds. When that happened, the victim might be carried screaming down into what was called the cockpit, where a surgeon's mate would treat him as best as he could, pulling out the splinter if possible, or cutting off the leg or the arm if necessary, and then staunching the wound with rags, issuing him a cup of rum, and putting him aside for the next man. Occasionally, the crew of a ship might board an enemy vessel, though this didn't happen as often as Errol Flynn did it in the movies. When two ships crunched together, sailors and Marines organized boarding parties that would scramble over the bulwarks and fight it out hand to hand. Most fleet actions, however, were resolved by gunfire before it ever came to that. If ships of the line were the battleships of the Age of Sail, frigates were the cruisers. Frigates were rigged like a ship of the line with 3 masts and square sails, but they carried only 1 row of guns, and those guns were much smaller. While a ship of the line often carried guns that fired balls weighing 24 or 36 pounds, the guns on most frigates fired balls that weighed 12 to 18 pounds or less. Frigates did not fight in line of battle. They were used for scouting, for trade protection, to attack an enemy's trade, or even for passing flag signals between the big ships in the battle line. Even smaller warships, such as sloops and brigs, carried fewer and lighter guns. They might have 14 to 20 guns, some of them as small as 6-pounders. These smaller vessels were used as commerce raiders, as escorts to merchant ship convoys, or to carry messages. But it was the ship of the line that was the measuring stick of navies in the Age of Sail. And in 1775, when the American Revolution began, the Royal Navy had more than 100 of them. Life on board these warships was no picnic. First of all, there was a vast gulf between the officers, especially in the Royal Navy, and the enlisted men. Officers were generally from the landed class. Some of them were the second sons of aristocrats who would not inherit the family title and were therefore sent off to either the church or the Navy, which was at least respectable. Many got their Navy commissions by family influence, if not by openly purchasing them. These second or third sons of the nobility generally began their service as teenagers. They went to sea at 13 or 14 with no preliminary training beyond the ability to read, write, and calculate. Once in the Navy, they would be effectively apprenticed to a ship's captain who might or might not be a family friend. Young and inexperienced as they were, these teen-aged officers in training were still technically officers and entitled to a salute. Even a grizzled 30-year-old veteran who had been to sea since before the youngster was born had to call them sir. These boy officers were called midshipmen because they generally served amidships during a battle, carrying messages from the quarterdeck to the gun deck when the noise of battle made it impossible to shout orders. When not in a battle, they were students of a sort, learning on the job, as well as informal teaching sessions when an officer, sometimes a petty officer, taught them practical trigonometry and navigation. On larger ships, they might also learn moral philosophy from the ship's parson. At age 19, they could sit for an exam, which, if they did well, made them a passed midshipman and eligible for promotion to lieutenant when a vacancy occurred. Generally, a lieutenant had to die or leave the service to create a vacancy before a passed midshipman could move up. If you did not pass the test, well, you could always try again later. Some of these young gentlemen, as they were called, remained midshipmen for years. There are cases of midshipmen over 30, though by then most would have seen the writing on the wall and left the service. The term midshipman survives today. It's the rank given to students at the United States Naval Academy, as well as to Naval ROTC students at American universities. Once these students complete their work and obtain a commission, they become ensigns, a rank that didn't exist in 1775. Once a midshipman became a lieutenant, further promotions were mostly a matter of seniority. A particularly skillful or lucky lieutenant might be plucked out of obscurity and made a commander, but in most cases they simply had to wait for an opening and that could be years, if not decades. Just as there were a few midshipmen over 30, there were more than a few lieutenants over 50. If they did get promoted and were fortunate enough to make post captain, their future was assured. All they had to do was stay alive long enough, and they were assured of becoming an admiral. The story of the enlisted men in the Age of Sail is quite different. First of all, while there were plenty of volunteer sailors in the Royal Navy of 1775, quite a few of them were pressed into service. Today, we would say they were drafted, though the process was not so bureaucratic in the Age of Sail. There was not much subtlety about it. It was assumed that every able-bodied sailor owed service to his king. So, if a Navy press gang put its hands on you, literally laid hands on you, you were in the Navy. No paperwork required. Once you were on board, the conditions were Spartan. It was so crowded that sailors slept in hammocks arrayed one above another with usually only about 18 inches between them. They slept in a compartment near the bow of the ship called the forecastle, which any sailor knows is pronounced forecastle. The name was archaic. It derived from the day when warships had actual castles, fighting platforms, built on the bow and the stern of the ship to accommodate archers. The castles had long since disappeared, but the name stuck. Since the forecastle was forward of the masts in the ship, serving as an enlisted sailor was also called serving before the mast. It was tedious, repetitive, and dangerous. Much of the work consisted of moving heavy objects, spars, sails, guns, cannonballs, all of it by hand. Setting or furling the topgallant sails up to 10 times a day or more meant climbing a rope ladder hand over hand to a wooden spar that was 60 or so feet above the deck. Then the sailors inched out along the spar to unfurl or clew up the sail by hand while standing on a rope, and there were no safety lines. Then, too, officers had the power of life and death over the sailors. If a sailor got out of line, or if an officer thought he was insufficiently respectful, the sailor could be beaten with what was known as the cat of nine tails. This was a whip with a wooden handle and 9 leather thongs with a piece of buckshot sewn into the end of each to ensure that the thongs cut through the skin. It was not a happy moment on board when a petty officer let the cat out of the bag. On such occasions, the ship's company was assembled to witness punishment. The beatings were sufficiently gruesome that they acted as a deterrent against future such transgressions. One of the few attractions to serving before the mast was that once a day, everyone lined up to be issued a pint of grog, which was essentially rum mixed with a little water. The promise of a grog ration gave the sailors something to look forward to and also left them half buzzed. The food was pretty terrible. Most of the meat, typically pork, was rancid from being stored aboard ship for months. It was salted down and packed into wooden barrels at the beginning of a journey to keep it from spoiling. Eating salted pork day after day made you terribly thirsty, and yet drinking water, like everything else, was strictly rationed. Such a diet led to all sorts of shipboard ills, including famously scurvy. In 1747, a Scottish physician named James Lind discovered that eating lemons or limes would prevent scurvy. Not every ship's captain was enthusiastic about providing limes to his sailors. Still, once it caught on, Royal Navy sailors were sometimes called limeys. So this was the life of a British sailor in the Age of Sail. It was, in short, pretty grim. And yet almost all of these traditions were adopted by the fledgling U.S. Navy, which was in effect modeled on the Royal Navy. That included the ranks, captain, commander, lieutenant, midshipman, as well as the ship types, though it would be some time before the Americans built a ship of the line. As on Royal Navy ships, American sailors slept in hammocks, were punished by the cat of nine tails, and looked forward to a daily grog ration. Even the uniforms were much the same. Officers in the fledgling American Navy adopted a version of the British uniform, a blue Navy broadcloth coat with red lapels and a red vest, a high collar, yellow buttons, blue breeches, and lace. Needless to say, camouflage was not a high priority. Sailors, on the other hand, wore whatever they had on when they came on board, occasionally updated from the leavings of the deceased, called a slop chest. This was the legacy left by the Royal Navy to the new American Navy when it was born in 1775. And that brings us back to the 7 Years' War, or if you prefer, the French and Indian War and the British victory at Quebec. After losing the citadel of Quebec, France agreed to cede all of Canada to Britain. This was great news for the British colonists in America because it removed the single greatest threat to their security, and it led some colonists to wonder just how much they really needed Britain's protection anymore. By itself, that would not have been enough to encourage the colonies to split with the mother country. But another consequence of the 7 Years' War was that the British emerged from it literally broke. To win the war, Britain had relied heavily on her navy, but she had also paid substantial subsidies to Frederick the Great of Prussia to keep the French army occupied on the continent. Navies are expensive. That's still true, by the way. And allies are expensive too, especially if you have to bribe them to fight for you. So when the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain was both victorious and broke. The government desperately needed to raise revenue. The citizens of the home islands were already heavily taxed, and so British policymakers decided to ask the colonies in North America to pay more. Up until then, the British government had not attempted to pry revenue out of their citizens in North America. The trade balance was working out fine. And as Prime Minister Robert Walpole put it, it was best to let sleeping dogs lie. Now, however, Parliament decided to wake up the sleeping dog. After all, the British government argued, the war had been fought in large part to defend the Americans from the French and from the Indians too, so it seemed only fair to ask them to pay their fair share. Well, we all know how that worked out. Americans violently protested the Stamp Act in 1765, and then, disguised as Indians, they dumped tea into Boston Harbor in 1773 to protest the Tea Act. Indeed, American opposition to any kind of taxation by Parliament eventually led to open resistance and full-scale rebellion. Thus it was that in 1775, the 13 British colonies in North America decided to throw off the mantle of British control for the right to make their own laws. It was a bold, even reckless decision, because Britain remained the greatest naval power on earth. Most Britons assumed the rebellion would be snuffed out in a matter of months, if not weeks. In that, of course, they were dramatically wrong.